Welcome back to Feeding Curiosity. We're back with Joe. Since if you couldn't tell the voice, I don't even know how long we've been talking. Probably like almost an hour, just catching up on things.
Nice little warm up.
But we're talking about ideas. Probably gonna do a year in review of just experiences.
Well, one of the things we were just talking about was Andrew Huberman's podcast with his dad, who's a physicist, and how they have different experiences of graduate school. Yep. Andrew had great mentors, and his dad had ones he didn't really care for. So the reason that came up is because I'm applying to PhD positions now. I recently had one interview. Hopefully I will have more soon. That kind of led into a discussion of the necessity for generalized thinking in an increasingly siloed academia.
Synthesizing ideas, especially from different domains together.
Yeah. Because that always appealed to me. Like when I was in undergrad, I did biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience. It's getting this three-pronged.
It's like philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience.
There are three different fields of thinking about
the brain.
Mind. You have biopsychology, so it's a real physical, right? Neurotransmitters.
More hardware focused.
Right. The biopsychologists will look at heart rate and
galvanic
skin response and pupil dilation and these sorts of things.
Oh, okay. So they actually look at the physical parameters.
Right, a physiological response. Yeah. And what that tells us about ourselves. For example, if you take pictures of buildings and you have short buildings and tall buildings, and they can be close or far, tall, close buildings produce more of a galvanic skin response and pupil dilation. So it's a sense of awe. Your eyes dilate. Holy shit. Look at all this wonder.
Take it all in.
And then you have the skin response is basically like you sweat a little, like a micro amount of sweat that produces an electric skin response, like as a conductor across your skin. And so you can pick up on the amount of electricity across your skin, and it's a sign of stimuli. Or being stimulated.
Right.
And so you're sort of preparing for action at the same time that your pupils were actually, they would dilate and then narrow in a kind of fluctuating way. So they didn't stay big, nor did they narrow to a point. Now, I don't know if that's common in these sorts of conditions or if this is just awe-specific, but if it is just awe-specific, then it looks to me like it can't quite pin down what it's seeing. Right? It doesn't know if it should take more information in or if it should narrow to a point.
And to me, that kind of lends itself because it's something that we're not biologically adapted to, right? Like a large building that's so huge.
It should be awe-inspiring.
Like outside of a mountain, maybe.
Right. Once in a while, you'll catch a glimpse of an enormous cloud structure, and you can kind of see the whole thing well lit and everything, and that can be beautiful and also kind of awe-inspiring in a similar way.
Yeah, you might actually be interested. There's a book by Dacher Keltner. He's a scientist too. It's literally a book on awe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of scientists talk about this book as like being really fascinating.
I'll definitely read that.
So for those of you who are interested in awe, I think this is a good place to start. Yeah, it says, it's like, how do you quantify the goosebumps we feel when we see Grand Canyon? Like literally that's the opening line on the description. I think one of the other things that I've actually seen around awe is they call it like a childlike experience where you have, when you're a child, you're always awe-inspired because everything's new to some degree.
You haven't simplified things down to a category.
Exactly, like Z when he runs around and sees something new. But yeah, like when you have a new, like a child running around and everything they see, they're like, "Oh my god!" They run across the room and there's something else that grabs
their life is wonderful.
And so I think they talked about that because awe then can inform gratitude, because you can be grateful for the things you see in your life.
Oh, interesting.
You know, from an adult standpoint, because
I'm happy I have this. I'm grateful for it.
Right. Because as we age, part of what aging is like we have this narrowing of new experiences.
Yeah, right.
And so we it's like, oh, well, been there, done that, right? Like I've seen a tree or I've seen a sunset or something.
Right, and you'll actually what you'll end up seeing is something like the concept that you've created and now have narrowed the experience down to.
Yeah.
It's no longer relevant.
And now it's just that is tree.
Yeah.
You know, it's not really fascinating.
Yeah. Now if that tree started standing up and moving and walking towards Isengard, then you'd have a very different experience. Yes. Suddenly the tree would be something more than a tree.
Exactly.
And the wonder would open back up, but that doesn't happen, unfortunately.
Sadly.
Yeah, tragic, no walking trees.
Yeah. Wild.
I know. So that sense of wonder can be measured with biopsychological, but you also have cognition, which looks at things very much computer-like almost,
Okay.
where it's very abstract.
Software-ish.
Yeah, kind of. Except it doesn't touch on the brain, but that's really more of a neuroscience perspective where it's looking really at brain regions and this sort of. So anyway, these were three different ways of approaching psychology. I wouldn't say I didn't buy the distinction, but for me, I was always interested in meaning in life.
Right.
As a psychological structure. What's the point of life? What's meaning? What's all this?
Mm-hmm.
And so the methods, I didn't care so much what the method was. It's like whatever one will help me
Right.
get a better,
to have a better map experience.
right? Or some synthesis of all of these things that
Right.
would give me a different perspective, right? I was always caught by the parable of the blind man and the elephant,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where you have a whole bunch of blind men
Right.
who are feeling around, and one of them is touching around. They're like, oh my god! It grabs the leg, and it's like, oh, it's a tree trunk. And then the other one touches the trunk, thank you, and goes, oh my god, it's a python. What the hell?
Right. They think it's a
tree?
snake or something.
Right, it's a python. You madman. Another one touches the ear. It's like, no, it's a fern. Or
Yeah.
whatever. And they're all doing this, and then a sighted man comes along and says, you guys, it's an elephant. Right. And
Right.
notices that the truth of the matter is a synthesis of all their information.
Well, I think that's like a good parable of all of our times in general, is that you get all these different people, not just scientifically like looking at something as massive as human experience, right? Trying to describe what it is that's going on in between our ears. But I think that's a problem of the internet right now, where you can have all these different people who take a perspective and try to use that one lens to describe a phenomena, or like, politics being the easy one, since this was a election year, is like there's always someone who tries to extrude an event through one lens or another. Yeah. And it's like, you guys are missing it. It's like, why don't we stop putting a lens in front of it and just say what it is, instead of trying to say, well, because of this thing first. It's like you're hedging your bets in a lot of ways. And it's like, I've always thought that having something like you're saying, where you have this summarized standpoint of like, okay, use every tool at your disposal, gets you, it's like, okay, if you only can use like a pen light, right? Like why not combine everyone's pen light together?
Yeah.
to see what you're looking at.
Right. That's exactly the kind of way that I think about it. It's like, I just don't see the point. What I'm interested in is a topic,
right?
A specific topic, and not so much like developmental psychology at large or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, my topic is not confined to that.
Right.
There are some that might reasonably be so. Like if you're trying to figure out how language processes develop, then it makes sense that you would be a developmental psychologist.
Right.
But if you're looking at meaning in life, then
you need
I
to
can
use
look
every
at it from
tool.
a developmental perspective. I can look at it
right.
From a cognitive perspective. Like you name it, a historical one.
Right.
And so I took philosophy as a minor for that reason as well, because I wanted to get a sense of something that the bare empirical facts couldn't quite get to, which is maybe the synthesis of these things or the reason, whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's still the case for me, and that what I'm hoping to find in grad school in this next, or in a PhD program in this next phase of life, is a place where I can do that, where I have the freedom to do that,
to explore broadly around this meaning in life question, and
really be allowed to circumambulate, or to meander, to wander, to find these things, to allow my interest wherever it may lead,
right, to open as many doors as possible, effectively.
Right, to be encouraged. I can't, if I'm caught in a place where it's too narrow and too linear, it's going to be detrimental. I need to be able to wander around.
Yeah. Well, because I feel like, just like what you're saying is right. Like if you have a question that could be couched as a developmental psychology problem, right? You can create a study and do that study, maybe however long that takes. And then you have a new question, but maybe it's in a different category. And so then you do that study. And then over time, as you build a body of knowledge, you can then cross compare the studies you've done to see whether or not there's, a there.
Right. There's a convergence.
Right. To see, okay, does this get us closer? Because if you do those kinds of things, right, instead of just, I feel like so many studies, at least in science, are so disconnected, so abstract, that you don't know how they actually apply to one to another.
And when things silo,
exactly,
you end up having is social psychologists using different language for the same construct as has been discovered by cognitive psychologists.
Right.
And, never the two shall meet. And you could even have, I pray this doesn't happen too frequently, but it's hypothetically the case, that you can have a psychologist who spends their entire researching what they think is a new construct, only discover at the end of their career that this thing already has been mapped out by a different field in total.
Right. Yeah.
Or as totally as any scientific endeavor.
Right.
And so then it's like, oh, you've just wasted your life.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
To rediscover the same thing or just come up with the same answer.
Right. As before. And just having, missed it. Missed the fact that this was already there. I've heard criticisms of this. What I'm saying might be too harsh for this circumstance and reality.
Right. That's fine.
But I've heard criticisms of the concept of grit.
Yes.
As being just conscientiousness recapitulated.
I've heard that criticism lately too.
And that they don't sufficiently diverge. So what that would mean is that you put a measure of grit and you put a measure of conscientiousness.
They should equal the same.
Yeah, they would strongly correlate and predict the same thing. In fact, you'd find it's called multicollinearity. It's a problem. It's if you have two measures like that are super highly correlated in the same model, they actually create noise. And that's a problem. So you really, when that happens, you have to drop it.
Interesting.
So you get multicollinearity between grit and conscientiousness.
I mean, that's fascinating.
And that's not good.
It makes sense because, when you tell me grit, it just seems like a new wrapper for the same thing.
For industriousness.
Right. It just sounds like the same thing we're just using a new word for it.
Yeah.
That actually brings me to a new topic that I'm curious what your thoughts are, but
Can I put one little note on this?
Yes, go for it.
I'm talking about this meandering and everything. The place that I want to go to for this is the University of Chicago.
Yes.
It's the place.
And is it because, I'll get to my other thought, but to double click on that, is it because University of Chicago, their psychology department is focused on, or they have a researcher who's focused on this meaning in life question, or is it something else? Or
it's
yes,
multiple.
and?
Yeah, yes, and. So it's not only that they have one person that's focusing on this question, it's that they have 3 different people that are working on this question.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
In some or some very related question,
capacity.
Right. So wisdom, meaning, and self-transcendence are all closely related. Because
that sounds so fucking cool, by the way.
So
I'm a researcher on wisdom, meaning, and transcendence. What the hell?
Oh yeah, I love it. It's so right. It's so up my alley, man.
It's so you.
It's perfect. But the reason that they overlap is because meaning breaks down into significance, coherence, and purpose. Purpose is you have an objective in the future, and you're pursuing that thing, right? It gives you a purpose. You can have self-transcendent purposes. So things that are, right, my purpose for the moment could be going and getting some food.
Right.
But that's just for me. But if my purpose is something like justice or something like world peace, for God's sakes, this necessitates a thinking outside of yourself. And so you have to transcend yourself in order to pursue that purpose. Okay. So there are some purposes that are self-transcendent, and that relates self-transcendence to purpose and meaning in turn. Wisdom includes two facets. It's the good or pursuit of the good, and what they call perspectival metacognition.
What a word.
We're going to leave perspectival metacognition aside, except for the fact that it has to do with theory of mind, which is what I'm researching now.
Okay.
And then on the other hand, a pursuit of the good, right? Whatever that happens to be, being integral to wisdom, relates wisdom then to meaning and purpose. And so these things are all interconnected, and they kind of circle around each other and are pretty, I don't know, it's harmonious. It's beautiful connection to me anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So you have researchers that are working on all 3 of those there.
Wow.
And so you have a really nice place where it's like an incubator, presumably, that they're bumping shoulders with each other. Their grad students are talking to their other grad students.
That sounds cool, because if you have similar enough studies, even though they might be tangentially related to some degree, you could create this cool network of cross-pollination.
Yep.
Between different ideas.
Yeah, let's turn up the heat, right?
Right.
But it's like a pressure cooker, because
basically,
the way that a pressure cooker works is that it creates pressure so that all the atoms are
Right.
moving faster and bumping into each other more. That is what heat is.
Yes.
It's the speed of the atoms.
And the rate of collision.
Right.
At a molecular level.
Right. So let's turn up the heat, baby. Let's
Yeah.
let's do this.
That's cool.
Yeah. So okay. So that's one reason. The other reason is that the University of Chicago takes particular pride in how do you say this? In a kind of interdisciplinary approach.
Oh, really?
They advertise that. And so there's a wandering that's kind of facilitated.
They champion it.
And this becomes clear in two different ways. One is that their dissertations style is different than most places. Most places you have 3 published articles that you've done in your course or your PhD, and you kind of bring those 3 together into a big dissertation paper, and then that's what you publish at the end of your
right.
Or where you defend at the end.
Yeah.
Chicago wants more of a book out of it.
That's awesome.
And
I think that's so fucking cool.
Right. So they're encouraging you to go beyond even your own research and pull in
from other places,
or at least provide the possibility of pulling in an enormous amount of information. And a lot of the books that are published by the University of Chicago Press are like this, right? So they published, what's a good example? I think I'm right that they published the work of Jason Ananda Josephson Storm.
What a name.
Yeah, it's so his stuff, it tends to be like this. God, I hope I have that right. I'm pretty sure that they published meta.
We can add any corrections if we need it.
Jason A. Metamodernism.
Oh, okay, yeah. I remember you talking about.
It's really interesting.
That probably around the middle of the year.
Let's see. Is it? Yep. University of Chicago Press.
Nice.
If I got that wrong, I've been so sad. No, I was right. Okay, so Jason A. Josephson Storm's book, Metamodernism, was published by them, and it has a kind of wide-ranging style.
Yeah.
So if I was going to go to a university that fits well to my kind of natural way,
it's cool that they have their own press
going around. Yeah, a lot of universities do. University of Michigan Press is the one that publishes Simulacra by Baudrillard.
Wow.
But if I wanted, okay, so if I was going to find a place where it fit best, and you would imagine that place would facilitate, not just allow for, but actually facilitate, encourage a kind of meandering, synthetic, broad view, though rigorous,
right,
work of scholarship. Okay, Chicago has that. What's the topic that I'm looking at?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's meaning, and meaning is being touched on by all these, not only by one researcher, but by 3 researchers.
Right. Who are looking at a subcomponent of each.
Right, and who are really going at these things from different ways. I think
that,
one of them is a social psychologist. The other one is does a lot of neurology and cognition kind of stuff. So it's all there.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's the perfect, to go back to the awe idea, but the perfect playground, right? Like
I literally can't imagine a more perfect place.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting because I remember when we were younger, like high school-ish, it was to be meandering. That it was like, why do you waste your time? It always felt like wasting your time if you were interested in 2 things. I don't know if you ever got that impression.
Yeah.
But
it's increasingly narrow.
Right. Like it felt like you had to pick one thing and just stay there and like, well, pick your little sandbox and put like your stamp on it and say, this is my sandbox and I'm never going to step outside of it.
And I don't know about you, but I certainly never got a good reason why.
No, I've never, no one's ever told me why.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, I mean, I think this podcast is a perfect example of why the type of person I am, at the very least, about where my interests lay, which is basically fucking everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think it's
true.
But it's always kind of this point is that it doesn't need, because part of it too is that I don't remember exactly where this quote was, but it was like people, it was like kind of like poking fun at it, but it was there people who, I think it was like an ADHD post, but basically someone who goes off on a tangent, like a rant about something they're really excited about. And then someone basically is a party pooper and says, oh, why do you like that thing? or something like the eye roll, like Q eye roll.
Yeah.
And it's like, why do we do that to people?
Yeah. Welcome to education.
Right. Yeah. That's what I mean. It's like, why do we like try to burst someone's bubble if they're excited about a topic? Shouldn't you want to be like, go, like feed that fire in everyone?
Yes.
So that they go and tackle something crazy. Because especially now, right? Like if you look back through history about any major discovery or any major anything, it was someone was interested enough to try and solve it to some degree. Back 100 years ago, it was a lot easier to actually upon a discovery. Just because of the nature of the work required to discover those things, which is not taking away from those people, but the amount of time and effort needed today is just a logarithm to get to a new discovery. Look no further than what we saw a couple weeks ago with the quantum computing breakthrough with Google. But that just proves, even though technology accelerates, it's still, with technology accelerating, requires that much more effort. And so if we want young people to be able to do more impressive things, bursting their bubble early is not the option.
Yeah, not it.
It's definitely not it. And I think part of the reason we do these kinds of things is like me and you have these conversations is that so young people who feel drawn to whatever they're interested in, they don't lose the awe. They don't lose that spark, because if you lose it, then you'll either regret it for the rest of your life, most likely, because you'd be like, I wish I would have done that thing, whatever that thing might be.
Yeah. And
we need more people who are willing to look at the things they brush shoulders up against and be like, oh, wait, I might be able to use that somehow, some way. Because it's not about just being like, oh, those are my tools and these are my tools and I like my tools. And it's such a stupid, to me, it's just like you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's like you're putting one hand behind your back and say, well, I only use my left hand. So
yeah, it's weird. No, but think that, okay, so the best universities in the U.S., certainly, maybe there are exceptions, are R1 universities. So these are designations. I think it's just R1 through 3.
It's like research levels and stuff like that.
So if you're an R1 university, you do the most amount of research.
Okay.
Like top tier.
So it's like a D1 university, but instead of research. Sports, it's
research. Now, since Descartes, there's been that the way that you get to an understanding of the truth by a kind of removal of the mind, rationalization, a total rational way of being,
right? Yeah,
that's free of emotions, including emotions like enthusiasm. And so, it might not. Well, maybe it does over the course of many generations or 500 years. Could result in. I'm not saying it does, but could result in. This is a hypothesis. The continued hiring of professors who are sort of non-reactive people, maybe in general. And then what they're looking for is somebody who's as even-keeled and non-reactionary as possible. Now, that just might be their disposition. They're just super low in volatility, and that's fine. But if what you want, in some sense, is for people to go as far as they can, a lot of people need encouragement.
Yes.
And if that's just not a part of your character, that's that kind of, oh, there it is, and getting excited with other people, then you might actually be taking out the lifeblood, the essence, the fire right out of education.
I wonder if there's a study about enthusiasm that you could do about meaning in life. That'd be fascinating.
I wonder. Well, I would imagine that you would have an increasing amount. I would be unsurprised if enthusiasm is related to dopamine, and dopamine is related to purpose.
I could totally see that. Just from like a anecdotal standpoint.
Right. Because it would be enthusiasm would be something like an excitement for the reward that's coming, anticipatory reward.
Like, I think for me too is like I think part of the reason too that so this podcast was like an experiment for that, and I think I can say wholeheartedly now that we're getting back into the swing of things, because I basically took about 1.5 year hiatus, sum total. Some of it was calculated because I was burning out, basically trying to just spin all the plates with work and doing podcasting thing minute. And I had this, you'll actually enjoy this, but what I had unconsciously done is that I had turned being productive, which is like posting something, into the goal, but not what did it represent more broadly, right? Like
it was
the meaning was as long as I post something, then I'm doing something meaningful. Not I'm posting something meaningful, right? So that's why I do it. It was more of this like pull by the system and the algorithm. Like if I don't post anything, I'm going to get less views or whatever. You know what I mean? Like this weird twisted.
It's an inversion of the superordinate goal here.
Yes. And so I had inadvertently done that. And I was like, unironically kind of fallen out of love with the process because I was just.
Yeah, because now it's you're just checking boxes.
Yes.
It doesn't serve anything higher.
Absolutely. And so I did that and I was like, oh God, I'm turning this into something that I might loathe if I continue at it for too long of a period of time. And so by committing to the marathon, which happened to be a whole bunch of coinciding goals of like, part of it too was that I was kind of getting annoyed with the podcasting world. Like as the pandemic wore down, like I kind of rode the wave and was excited about like, at least I can do this social thing and like talk about ideas with people across the world still. But then as it kind of worn down because everyone and their mother got into the podcasting world over the pandemic, I just started seeing a whole bunch of random people talking about things and just, blabbing into the ether, so to speak. And I felt like, oh my God, I'm just repeating myself. I don't have anything new to say. There's all these other people doing it. And it's like, does my voice need to be added to the cacophony of the internet? And so I felt like, okay, well, if I do care, maybe what I need to do is step back from just producing content, as content creators say. And maybe I need to go, and I use this word, you're going to laugh, go back into the lab, which is real life, and just go get experiences again. And just live for a while. And maybe if there's something I need to write about or whatever, then I'll do it. Or if there's a quote that I feel like posting on Instagram or something.
Yeah, Ari Shaffir did this with comedy. Disappeared for like a year.
Yeah, and I did it. And like, and if I want to come back, then I'll come back when I feel inspired to do such. And ironically, we are. And it feels so crazy, like because I did now the marathon 2 times, and that was like the reason I did it. Is like, okay, if I'm gonna stop doing one thing, it might as well be filled by something that's grand, in a way, or at least crazy enough that a younger me would have been like, shit, I don't think I could do it. And I think part of that was because I got to treat myself as much of an athlete as I possibly could. You know how into performance and wearables and health stuff that I've been. I've never been an athlete, not in any real sense.
Right. Yeah, not as a career.
No, definitely not. But could I kind of, like you said, synthesize everything I've been absorbing probably the last 10 plus years since we started religiously going to the gym and just reading about health things? Could I apply that in a real sense and like turn my body into a thing that can do marathons? And at the very least, it wasn't to be like record breaking, because I knew that wasn't going to happen as someone who's not a historical runner, but could I do it in such a way where my body wouldn't break down? That was kind of like my goal, like avoid major injuries, and then kind of be like, this is what like an average person could do. You're still going to have to put a fuck ton of time into doing a marathon thing, because you're not going to just go wake up.
Yeah.
You're just not going to wake up tomorrow without running it ever and be like, I'll go run a marathon, because that's a recipe for disaster. But could you give yourself, 3 to 6 months to be prepared? I took a year twice to do it, but I think you learn, and I did a solo podcast not too long ago, just talking about some of the broader ideas around the marathon thing. But it was kind of this, at the time, like zone 2 training. I don't know if you've really followed that, was had just gotten really popular. So it's kind of a different take on endurance training. So, if you've heard Tabatas and like sprint work. So it's like go as hard as you can for 4 minutes, 1 minute break, repeat for like 4 cycles. Was like really popular early 2000s or so.
4 minutes, that'd be brutal.
It's very brutal. It's like really hard.
Balls out for 4 minutes?
Yeah. Or maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's like a minute and then 4 minutes off. But people know, if you've done Tabatas, people know what Tabatas are. But then right as I started doing the marathon, zone 2 training became really popular, which is like low and slow for like 40 minutes. So you do like your zone 2 heart rate, whatever that is for you. So for me, it's like 135 beats per minute. So it's not super difficult. It's like maybe you're breathing a little heavy, but you can still have a conversation and talk.
This is where wearables awesome.
Yes. And that's another part of it, because I was basically like, I don't have a trainer, but I have wearables. So could I use these technologies as a coach and just kind of monitor those things. And could I watch the trajectory of my data to like prove that I'm actually improving my fitness levels? And long story short, it actually does work. Like you can do these things.
Look at you engineering things.
Yeah, no. If you pay attention to your inputs, you can slowly work your way up to be able. Like my VO2 max, at least according to my watch, I'm at a 50 VO2 max, which is like really good. Like not really elite, but it's like getting there.
Nice.
And that was after 2 years of consistent running. And like that, and VO2 max is correlated with a whole bunch of long-term all-cause mortality reductions.
Cool.
So the better your lung capacity is, that's what VO2 max is. That leads to better overall health outcomes as you age, because the more volume of oxygen you can push through your lungs efficiently just means you can.
I would love to see if I could do that kind of this, what do you call it, level 2?
Zone 2 training.
Zone 2 training with martial arts stuff.
You probably could.
Bag work, these kinds of things, because I find running so damn boring. But like, and now it's controlled, and so that's really useful for the kind of stuff that you're talking about. So
what you could do, so this is what I suggest to people, just to try and do it, is, and it's not like you have to do anything crazy. Like the doses they're talking about is like maybe 2 times, 3 times a week at most, 40 minutes, and you could break it up. You could do 20 minutes in a day, and that's all you need to do. But the thing I would say is like kind of a brisk walk. If you got a dog, perfect. Because if you have a dog and you go on a brisk walk around the neighborhood for like 30 minutes, 2 times a day, boom, you're done. Like that's zone 2. That's why actually people with pets have higher all-cause mortality rate, or better all-cause mortality, because they're more generally active. So the goal is unironically, is it basically it's like making your entire cardiovascular system just more efficient. And it's kind of counterintuitive, at least how people would think about this, because most people think you have to redline your system to get real gains.
Yeah.
But realistically, you actually don't want to do that. You want to be at a low grade of intensity so that your body adapts slowly over time, so that when you do redline, now you have an extra gear that you didn't know you had, because your body is adapted all the way down here.
Interesting.
And so it's like you really want to do 80% of your workouts in the lower, zones 2, 3, and then get like 20%, 10% into zone 5 and go balls to the wall.
I've heard not quite the same, but something similar going on with lifting, where you need to deload.
Yes.
Right, because if you're going crazy all the time, you'll basically reach a point where, because the body doesn't have to operate on the same calendar or clock that we do, it could be that the rate at which you recover is slower than the rate at which you attack that muscle.
You're nailing it,
and
by the way.
Right, so then what would end up happening is that you'd have a compounding soreness that's increasingly occurring. And over an enormous amount of time, I can imagine increases the likelihood of injury.
Yep. Fatigue wear, basically. Like if you think about a structural building, right? Like if you redline a vehicle or something all the time, or think of it in this way: sports cars, right? Sports cars are designed to go really fast and be super nimble on the track, like F1. But those things take ungodly amount of maintenance because they're such high performing vehicles. Of course, they need that much maintenance. But now think of like an everyday car you drive on the road. Maybe you take it once every 3 months.
Yeah.
Different level of strain put onto that. Your human body is just the same way. It just has many different layers of this thing, not just muscles and tendons, but you have to think about your nervous system too.
Yeah.
And so that's what HRV is kind of telling you, is like
the strain on your nervous system.
Yes. And that informs how much strain then your muscles and cardiovascular system can take.
Right. And that can be physiological or even psychological stress.
Both. Yes. It's a yes and for sure.
Very cool.
So it tells you, it informs all these things.
But there is no mind-body distinction.
That's bullshit. Not at all. Yeah. Because if you say you feel sick, right? Like you just got sick from something and you're coming out of it. Yeah. You might go on a run or try to lift a bunch of weights and feel weak. And you're like, well, I didn't do really anything. Like I haven't done anything for 3 days because I was just sick. But that's because your body, like the nervous system of your body, is still clearing out the bullshit from your system. And so of course it's not going to operate at, you might have, 70% of your normal capacity, even though you didn't have a physical injury,
Right. So so in a lifting context, what you're doing is deloading, and that you're not stopping lifting, but what you're doing is something like a maintenance period.
Yes.
And that's so that your body can catch back up with its recovery.
Oh, you're like nailing it too. Cause I want to talk about this idea. Because it circles back to the whole reason.
Which, by the way, there's probably something like a psychological deloading that you do.
Yes.
Right. So that it's actually necessary for you to have a weekend, and not the weekend the weekend can't be
Go back and do
just
more
continuing
work.
doing a bunch of kind of work over that weekend and pretending like you're deloading. You're not.
That's
You
why
actually have
vacations
to
are
take a
actually
step away.
important.
Yep.
So
It's why I suspect that um, uh, religious traditions like the biblical tradition mandate a Sabbath.
yes,
Right.
a day where you can't do anything.
Right. It's actually functional.
Yes.
Right. And that's why you do it.
I've been playing around with this idea because along with the zone 2 thing, right? Like, that's a physical activity, but is there a zone 2 for life, right? Because life is a marathon, realistically.
Yeah.
Life is a marathon. And then also, because what I did with the podcast is like, I had to put the podcast to the side, I had to deload the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now my new theory is like, maybe we need to periodize our lives, right? Because, so for instance, me and you are people who are always trying to absorb new, like learn about new things that might be interesting to us. But maybe we need to learn a bunch new for maybe a month and a half or something, and then synthesize shit for another month and a half.
Yeah.
And then go back to new, and then just keep recursion.
I wonder if
over and over again, because if you just constantly are pushing, you're just going redlining yourself, and this is another theory coupling to this is like pushing it back against this hustle culture that you see on the internet for type A people who want to get a lot out of life.
Yeah.
It's like, I think we have one half of the equation, because it's like the same people who want to do a lot from their life, but you need to also learn to chill and embrace
and actually live
the slowness. Yeah. Like embrace the slowness and be with people that you enjoy being around, like us. Like, even though we're recording this is also our way of like,
yeah, and I
talking about things.
Yeah, I want to go on a tangent, but I'm going to avoid it. But I take your point. Right? There is a necessary deloading here. I think that I kind of like the quarter system if it operates the way that I think that it operates.
I mean, it kind of, you can break it up however you want.
Where
it's
you could imagine that you have a version where instead of 4 months on a break, 4 months back on, and then a long break, you would do something
I
like
see what you're saying.
3 months, 3 or 4 times or something like that.
Yeah, in a year.
That includes in each thing like some kind of longer break.
Right.
And so you can kind of go all out for a few months, but then you have a designated period at the end of those times.
Right. Just to relax and recuperate.
Right. Whereas a full summer off might be not optimal. And that's actually because you can wind back down to a non-activated way of being, where you want to sort of stay in a healthy middle ground.
Yep.
That you want to be able to really test yourself and improve, and then be able to turn off and relax, and then go, I'm so ready to get back in the game.
Right.
And then you're back at it and then relax, instead of going crazy, burning out halfway through,
right,
and then sort of getting relaxed, or burning out halfway through and then having a summer and totally collapsing and then having a hard time getting the momentum out again.
Exactly. Like, I think part of it is that people end up, especially if you're like in a high powered position of some kind, I think what ends up happening is people get so used to being at a certain threshold of activity. That doesn't mean productive, by the way. You just activity, doing shit. And so when you do, like, when you reach your crescendo, you get a major project done, but then they crash because they know they have other things that need to be done to get the next thing going, right?
Yeah.
They don't ever let themselves celebrate or even just be like, I did it, right? Like, can you go home from your job or whatever thing that is that takes up a lot of your time and just be cool with it? Like, can you go home and just turn off your brain and put on a movie or play video games or spend time with people that you really care about and just bask in it? Not think about your emails, not think about whatever needs to be done, and just give yourself even 10 minutes, 15 minutes, dinner, you know, and just be okay with that. Because I think that is a skill in of itself. Because I am definitely fallen into that trap before. And I think now, as I get into the 30s, it's like, okay, how do I learn how to be high functioning in both ways? Can I go get shit done? And then when work is over, can I go home and, enjoy my time and not be a stress ball and whatever?
Yeah.
And
one of the things that to kind of reinforce this concern about hustle culture, psychoanalytically, it looks to me like some of it as being a projection of progress sort of onto the external world.
Yes.
That intrapersonal progress onto the external world. And so you might say that that if I can just accomplish these 5 goals, whatever, that maybe it's to lose 10 pounds, maybe it's to do these things.
Yeah.
Not to say that they aren't useful. I'm sure they are, or to some degree. That they're a facsimile of personal progress.
Yes.
And they're not. They're at best a kind of proxy,
Right.
you know.
It's like a proxy for acceptance, like self-acceptance.
It
or
might
something
be
like
that what you need to work on is yourself, and
Yeah.
not building a business or
Right.
whatever it happens to be.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
The real, and then maybe you can white knuckle it, and then you can successfully accomplish whatever it happens to be. I worry that if you haven't dealt with your underlying problems before going and changing the world, then you'll export your problems onto the world.
That's a theory.
Right.
I never thought about it that way, but
And so you're going around and you're changing things in your own image, but you don't understand that you've got some demons.
But your room is still a mess, to quote Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, that would be. But it may be that you're exporting your demons, and it's like you're gonna. I think that human beings have a tendency, whether they like to or not, to form their world in their own image.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have a total understanding of yourself, a complete understanding, then you're going to think that what you're doing is all good. But that's really just because you're not seeing the ways that the bad parts of you are acting out in the circumstance.
Interesting.
And so you're still doing all the bad stuff, but you're just telling yourself that it's all good because you're all good.
Right. There's nothing wrong. You're lying to yourself.
So I'm with Jung on this one. You need a complete understanding.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think that's kind of been like the long story of all this thing is like, how does one understand themselves? And it's just a long, a long exploration of just figuring it out. And I mean, and it's not to say, because I think the other part of hustle culture is like this, it's like the self-improvement trap where you could always just try to work yourself. You know, if I do meditation, if I do, you know, morning sunlight, if I go to the sauna, if I, you know, you just stack all these things that are supposed to quote unquote make you better. But are you really doing those because they make you feel good? Or, kind of going back to the science, are you doing them because some research said that if you do these things, you'll be 5% happier?
Yeah. And you're treating yourself like a machine.
Right.
Yeah. Or you're how do you say this? You're saying I'll be a good person if I do these things. But again, you're projecting this
good
thing
whatever.
Outside of yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe being a good person is about a self-understanding, is about after having gained that kind of awareness, a willingness to sublimate even your worst tendencies towards something that's good for yourself and for other people and community, society, and so on.
Right. And so forth.
Right. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it isn't just checking off a bunch of boxes and then therefore you're good.
Right.
Right.
And that's kind of, because that part of me is, obviously, you know, that I like engineering and all these things, but it's like, I still think science misses something about what it means to be fundamentally human. Because you can science your way, but there's still a part of it that is unknowable. Or at least it's like, it's not as simple as like 1 + 1. It's not an equation, right? Like you can't solve for meaning in life. There's no like y = mx.
Well, there's a problem that
you know,
that with sciences it is now, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And it's that it has to reduce things down to a manageable size.
True. Yeah.
And so if there are some subjects that inherently, like, to reduce it is to change the thing, is to miss it, right? That it's a consequence of some kind of extended cognition,
right?
Or it's a very dynamic process where all parts are influencing all other parts, maybe like a living being, or nature, right? Chaos, mathematics. There's what's the book? Chaos
Theory
by Glick. I forget his first name. Is a good kind of explanation of this. If in trying to reduce those things, you end up missing the mark.
Right.
And so,
because by reducing, you have to trim some of the input,
what it is,
some of the input, so you might be missing a part that's intrinsically important.
You could end up thinking about people in a reduced way, and missing the whole.
Yeah.
Right. Or just missing what's outside your very narrow realm of expertise. Right. And worse than that, worse than just reducing it. It's reducing it in a particular way. It's reducing it in the way that a human being can manage and manipulate.
Mm.
And so if you start to think of, so let's say you're studying human beings, you're a psychologist, and you start to think of human beings as what is true about human beings are the things that you can manage and manipulate. You might come to believe that human beings can be managed and manipulated.
Right. Yeah.
Without understanding that your understanding is only a small sliver of the enormity of a person.
Right.
And that it might not, in fact, be as deterministic as it appears in the lab. That you can reinforce with ideas of quantum physics, where at the bottom it seems like everything is inherently a probability. There's
right.
That it is an unknown, that it isn't deterministic at the bottom. It's kind of this strange randomness, this chaoticness. Reinforce it with chaos theory, where when the mathematics assumes that the thing is inherently unpredictable, by definition unpredictable.
Yeah.
Then you can actually paradoxically better predict, for example, the heartbeat.
Huh. Wow.
Right. So there's that something. Or any dynamic system.
Right. I think that's one of the things that
you have to assume that you can't know it.
Right. I think that's honestly one of the things that I think this digital age has done a major disservice to people, because we've all been trained for this quick repeatability, this almost semi-static environment, right? Like you can go on any website or go to like any major chain, and it's all relatively the same. And that's just like a modern marvel for a lot of these things. But most of human experience is this dynamic system, right? Like and trying to overlay a static system on a dynamic system is just never it's not a good hypothesis. And I think a lot of people are hoping something semi-static, like the digital world, but or it's like grasping at something like trying to hold sand or water in your palm of your hand. You know what I mean? And it's like we've been misled, I guess is probably the best way to put it, because it's not really anyone's fault. It's just these are the environments we all operate in, and so it's easy to be misbelieve that things are simpler than they appear.
Yeah. When we've made our lives manipulable,
right,
you start to think reality is manipulable.
Yes.
And now there's some very dangerous consequences to that kind of thing.
And I think it's like part of it is like just kind of learning to be a surfer.
Right.
like in a weird,
that's the Tao,
in
that's
a Zen,
Wu
yeah,
way,
in a weird Zen way, but like it's so true. It's like not being like, of course there's gonna be things that suck and you're gonna be upset or whatever, you have a bad day. But it's like at the same time, it's like cool, whatever. Like you just gotta roll with it. It's like, have you been doing enough of this? Do you know yourself well enough that you know you can handle it? Kind of. And if the answer is yes, then cool. Keep doing that. Don't give up.
Yeah.
Because if you keep riding that and keep being cool with that, then you can't really fail. Because like I don't know, the life doesn't have a report card as far as I know.
Yeah, failure is okay. So I'll give you a Christian version of this.
Yeah.
God is reality in total. That includes your experience. That includes your emotion, everything.
Yeah,
all synthesized. Totality. It includes the facts as well. The facts would just be a very narrow part of God.
Right.
Just like you're in fact a narrow.
Mm-hmm.
It's your distance from God that's sin. Okay, so you can think of that as anything that's an obstacle between you and God is wrong, including your projected expectations of reality. Right. So if you come to an experience with another person, not viewing them as John Doe or whatever, but instead as the Republican or the Democrat.
Right. Yeah.
And then you treat them like this stereotype you have in your head, that would be a sin.
Okay.
So, right. And because it's removing you from God, right? It's removing you from the total experience.
Right.
So that distance is the problem, in fact. And that it's not about perfection in some sense. What it's about is just contact. And that all the things that you might think of as being kind of the perfect person in a very kind of shallow moralistic way. They're nice or whatever. Nice, fair, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Those are byproducts of a closeness with God. Right? It's not the point, actually. Point is to get as close to experience as possible.
Right.
And to live in that way. It just happens to be that when you do that,
it's like a living without projection, I guess. Like,
yeah,
don't
right.
let your conscious or subconsciousness or whatever it is that projects onto experience.
And the psychoanalytic version of that would be that all the law in psychoanalysis is that what's repressed is projected. And so
what you're afraid to what you're afraid to address,
to make conscious, right, to acknowledge, all of those parts of you will end up on somebody else. Right, so you think that you refuse to acknowledge that you can be cruel to people because you're a perfect little princess. Then all the people who are actually perhaps even being very good to you are going to appear to you like the villains, because you won't acknowledge the fact of what you're doing. That you're not a victim. No, you're not a princess.
Right.
You have agency, and you are the ones that is causing these problems in your life, not these other people.
Right.
Right. So you could imagine that those projections are a thing that get in the way between you and reality or God. And so that you have a moral duty to make the unconscious conscious.
Yeah.
In an attempt to remove those projections in your experience, and so you can see God fully.
I have kind of an interesting, it's not really a tangent, but it could be considered that, but it's similar kind of experience of like dropping that valence, like pretending like, oh, we're different. Like us modern people are better, fundamentally better than people at any point in history or whatever. It's easy to have that standpoint. But it was from listening to the Fall of Civilization podcast, the one I sent you on the Mongols. And what was fascinating about it is that it's the sound design they did on it, because they basically have native speakers for the translation. So historical records from like Persians or Chinese or whatever that they have, like it starts out with the native language and then has the English translation on top of it. And then does all the sound work to kind of like ground it in whatever the quote is talking about. So like if they're describing a city, you get like city sounds or whatever. Or just like kind of like the oral histories of the Mongols and like their mythology and how they contextualize the rise of Genghis Khan. But like even before that, before he was he was just Temujin, just some poor boy in the middle of Mongolian steppe. But what was crazy about it is, like, to me, it was the first time I ever realized in history that listening the way that they presented it, it didn't feel like ancient past, it felt like, oh shit, these are people who are no smarter than us. They just happen to live in a less sophisticated time, like technologically speaking. But they still thought and behaved just as much as any of us would think and behave today. It's just we have different ways of describing those things. And they must have thought, oh yeah, this is, what it's always been like to live like a human. Just like we think it's this like, and I felt like, oh my God, human history is like, it's like a fantasy novel, but it's real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This like weird, like I felt connected to this weird past somehow of like, oh my God, like once you realize that history isn't just, I think it's because the way history is presented, it feels disconnected, like you've cut off an arm or whatever, and it's like, well, there's an arm there.
Yeah.
Shit. Because it's like dusty tomes in a historical place or whatever, and it doesn't feel real. But then when you realize like, no, these are people's lives that were just as vibrant as any life ever. It's just the way it's presented feels like it's not connected to you. And when you just drop it, like the cultural context and like, oh my God, the Mongols killed millions of people. It's like, well, that's not really that surprising because look at history. But like, I don't know. I just felt like this weird connection to the past that I'd never really felt before. I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're all part of this weird continuum.
It's one of the downsides of a book even.
Yeah.
Right. Because it reduces all the other senses.
Yeah.
Right. So you don't get the full experience unless you have a really active imagination.
Yes.
But that can be facilitated by the sound.
That's why I was like, damn, this is like, it felt like an audio documentary. Like the only thing missing was no video. But like, it didn't take a whole lot of extra effort to be like, oh yeah, there's like, you could feel like there's something real happening to these stories, and just even just like how the the infighting between his sons as the Mongol Empire falls apart. It's like, oh yeah, this is just a dysfunctional family, like any dysfunctional family. It just so happens they're
What's that? The Mongol warlord wasn't good at raising his kids,
right? Or he hadn't thought about succession because he knew he didn't. Oops, he didn't live forever either.
Oh,
it's like these same things. Like, oh, dad didn't write a will, so maybe we got to figure that out, or whatever. It's like it just so happens he controls half the empire, or half the world's landmass and empire at that point in time.
Yeah.
Oops,
whoopsie,
not ready for that responsibility.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's like it's funny because it's like, I don't know. It's almost like if you can step back from your own bullshit to some degree, and not being so quick to be like, well, if I, it's so easy to be like, if I lived, if that was my life, this is what I would do. Whatever.
Yeah. But if you don't know yourself, then again, you're gonna bring your demons.
Of course, yeah. So it's interesting. I don't know. I don't know. It's one of those things that I think, and maybe this takes time, because I don't know. I don't know if I was part of it. I think because I was reflecting on this a couple weeks ago, is like, because I think certain people are just more intrinsically like introspective than most, or than. I mean, I think people have some introspection in general, but it's just like some people are more willing to
go there.
Yeah,
I wonder. I don't know. Jung's version of extroversion, introversion was something like that.
Oh, really?
That an introvert tends inward and is interested by the parts of their own being.
Interesting.
Whereas an extrovert is interested in the external world.
Oh, wow. Okay, I never thought of it that way.
That doesn't seem to be what extrovert and introvert mean now.
No, not at all.
Right?
Not even a little bit.
It's more of a social thing. It's
a social valence.
How much time you want to spend with people. So, but you're hitting on something that has, I don't know if there's any evidence evidence or a line.
Because I feel like there was always this richness of internal experience, even from a young age, but young me didn't have the words to be able to describe it. It's only now, after like probably around my early 20s, that I felt like I had enough of a sense of how to describe it. It was more a lot of like impressions, it's like internal currents or something of like
an intuition about the thing.
Yeah,
intimation.
But because you don't have enough internal experience to be able to like, or rather, it's because you don't have enough external experience. You don't know how to map things internally. And I don't know. There's a work in progress.
Yeah. Right. There is something about young life where you sort of have an inchoate concept of particular things. And throughout the course of your life, you develop that concept into an adult version of the concept that's well fleshed out and differentiated. So maybe that's maturity. It's different.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like, because especially as we've done this, I feel like when I read old blog posts or listen to old podcasts, there's like a weird, it's almost like I'm not watching the same person, even though it's me. It doesn't feel like me, if that makes sense. Like when I go back through now and I post old clips from old episodes, even though like a year ago, it's not a whole lot different about me a year ago. But I'm like, oh yeah, that was a good thought, me. Like it's like this weird like, it's like this weird feeling of almost like an audio diary of like capturing thoughts and things like that. And I think it's one of those things that I kind of wish, even if you never have a podcast or something, it's like, it might be worth people just doing that. Like getting
like a journal.
Yeah. Like getting snapshots of how they think and what they see about the world, or even key experiences they're having. Because I think you can understand more about yourself and how like the tides of your personality as it changes and shifts over years, that you can see like, oh yeah, you aren't static. Because I think a lot of people view themselves as static, especially like it's easy to believe that after high school or college, where it's like, it's like I'm fully formed or whatever that means. And I just don't think that's true. Because you might think you're fully formed, but it's like whenever you freeze yourself in time, that version of you thought they were fully formed. but then there's still changes and shifts that happen regardless.
Yeah. It's nice to see that too. I like the reminder from the past.
Yeah.
It partly kind of gives you a sense of continuity.
Yeah.
In that you look at the old self and you go, oh, I kind of that. And I see now how I've changed from that thing.
Yeah.
And you can kind of track the progress of your life.
It's like easy to forget it.
Yeah. It reminds you're a work in progress.
Yeah.
This thing is still going on.
And it's like an evolving story, right? Because like kind of like what you're saying like about dynamic systems. I feel like so much of the last couple of years is kind of realizing that like it's not only just like this internal thing of like you're a dynamic system but there's also the world, like the culture that you're embedded in is a dynamic system. And almost everything you're a part of, like the rushing nesting doll, is that it's all dynamic systems interplaying at each other with unfathomable amount of variables.
Yeah.
Right. And so to even pretend like you have it all figured out, or that you could you could see through the matrix and know how it all should, like if we just did this one thing, it would be utopia, which that would be a whole separate podcast if we talked about why utopias suck. But but I've been really thinking about that lately, especially because of how people get all whipped into shape about politics these days, where it's so simple and yet so not simple.
Yeah, there's a lack of there.
Yes. And so it's like I end up just falling back onto, and I think that's why we're able to do these things, but it's just agency. It's just giving every person as much agency in their own life as you possibly can.
It's part of it.
It's not all of it.
I'm less interested in agency than I am in completeness. Now they're intertwined.
I was going to say, what makes you say completeness over agency?
That you can be very active in changing the world and still be, well, you can still be dangerous. You can still be creating
kind of
problems.
What you're saying is like adding demons in your own likeness to the world.
So it might be that what happens if you pursue agency instead of completeness is that you could end up sacrificing completeness for agency, and then the things that you didn't take into account ruin you.
I mean, completeness sounds very almost like Zen-like, like Taoist.
Yeah, it probably is.
It's like,
it certainly comes. I mean, I'm influenced by Jung here, but like it is a kind of you're trying to account for all the parts of yourself and then bringing them into right order. Right, that under the highest possible purpose, all the different parts of yourself.
Would you say it's equilibrium?
Yeah,
is another word.
Equilibrium would be a form of that, right? And you could have continually ascending equilibriums.
Right. That's the other part I was thinking, is because I was thinking like, it's equilibrium within yourself, equilibrium within like your partner or family unit, whatever you call it. Equilibrium within the broader family, right, and friends, and
that's Peterson having learned that from Piaget,
right? Yeah,
right.
Because I've been thinking about that a lot too, along with the dynamic systems. Now that I've had a relationship for over a year, it's like learning to how do you map two dynamic systems together, right? Because I think people oversimplify relationships, to this unfathomably unrealistic goal,
and they have to be equilibrated,
right?
And that equilibrating process isn't. It can be a kind of common abstraction, but if that abstraction becomes decoupled from the concrete reality, then you're in danger. It needs to be something like how they're genuinely unified.
Right.
It's hard to describe exactly, but you would imagine that there'd be some sacrifices on both ends in attempt to unify them.
Yeah.
And that sacrifice is necessary. They can't actually both be, they can't just both stay exactly the same and then pretend like they're part of a common unity. That they're
right. Yeah.
Then it's in some sense, it's not real. It's just oneness, an aggregate. It's an aggregate, not a unity.
Right.
It's just bringing things together in a pile and being like, we've done it. They're all
right. And then it's like, that's your half and this is my half. Cool. We're good.
Right. Everything stays exactly the same. Nothing changes. It gets in a real unity. Things are changed in the process of that unification. And that what you would want from this.
And like learning to contend with that, right? Like something as simple as what side of the bed do you want to sleep on, right? Or like,
and that conversation could be a door into self and other understanding.
Right.
Because what it could be is that you say, okay, well, you have this bed and you have it in this room. And let's say this is a queen size bed and you're there with your partner and it's up against the wall. Right. And one person can sleep up against the wall and the other person can't. So now there's a question of, okay, who's more comfortable in which position? Maybe who gets up for work first, because you don't want the person who gets up later
have
to be
crawl
crawling
across
over the other person.
Right.
Right. So there's all these discussions about how you unify yourself with each other and the bed and your life and the room and so on.
And it sounds banal, right? Like that's I've kind of been obsessed with like the everydayness of things, but that inform the big picture.
Yes.
You know? Because it's like, if you can't figure out how to share a bed, or another quote that I saw was, if you don't like having the conversation with your significant other, like, how was work? Maybe you shouldn't be with that person, because you're going to have that conversation at least a couple thousand times with your significant other. So as well, just like, hey, making sure it's as interesting as you possibly can make it, because that's going to happen a lot.
Yeah.
And even though, and it sounds so trite, but it's like, that kind of is what a relationship is.
Yeah. It's proper negotiation with, it's not a negotiation in that you're trying to win or the other person's trying to win, and you're just trying to win as much as you can, given that you're with this other person.
Crazy it's actually put it in that language.
Right. It's more winning. Like you're negotiating your way forward towards some higher good. The good is right. You're trying to get the most good out of this situation as possibly can be made. And you're using both of your minds to discover that.
Yeah. And it's like a never ending process. Cause like it's not the static thing, right? Because even though that person might have seemed to have like this answer, whatever that might be, whatever thing you're talking about, it can always change. And it's like, you have to reevaluate and address those things. Because I think part of it too is that it's easy to get swept up into the currents of life. I think that's another thing that I've been kind of thinking of, is that if you don't consciously choose to make certain decisions in your life will make a decision for you.
You could end up in a position where you are operating on autopilot.
Yes.
Until the things that you've neglected pile up or expand so much that you can't ignore them.
Right.
It's kind of like such a big problem.
It's almost like The Matrix. Is it kind of a way of thinking about that? The movie, not Matrix as an idea, but like you could use The Matrix as like a way of thinking about that, right? Like if you just want to sleepwalk through life, eventually there'll come a point where it's like, hey, buddy.
Life, I forget. There's a quote here that's something like, you can chase out nature with a pitchfork, but she always comes back. Something like this. I can't remember who said it. It's at the beginning of Mary Harrington's book, Feminism Against Progress.
That's good.
Anyway, it's the same idea. You can chase out life with a pitchfork and it's always going to come back.
Right.
Which is like, I think Freud had like the Revenge of the Repressed.
Oh, wow.
Similar idea.
I mean,
whatever you
Freud would have a lot to say about this period of time. Yeah. Damn. I mean, that's so true, because it's like, and I feel like part of it too is like, since I turned 30, it's like, there's no point in not being upfront about things, because it's either you're lying to yourself or you're afraid to admit it.
Yeah.
Those are the only options, kind of.
Yeah. And lying to yourself and lying to other people are very similar.
Yes.
Right. That it's often you lie to other people so that you can lie to yourself.
Yeah. It's like at some point when I was probably about before 30, but it was like, I was not afraid to admit it, but it's like wanting kids. It felt like as a dude in your early 20s, saying you wanted to be married and have kids was like,
lame, dude.
Whoa, dude, you want to get,
dude, go to college,
like wrangled, like you want to settle down. Ew, you don't want to party or something like that.
Yeah, it's something in the culture.
Yeah.
Going. Still has that going.
Definitely still has it going. But for me, it was never like, it was like, well, maybe I shouldn't admit it or whatever. It wasn't that I was like afraid to admit it, but it was just like, you kind of like the subtle undertone that if you admitted it too soon, then people would run away from you. or like the culture would run away from you, like, ew, you're weird for like.
It'd be hard to date if everybody was on a different page.
Right.
Right. You probably intuited that, and then
something like that.
Then self-censored.
Yes, it was a self-censoring. But then by the time it was like mid to late 30s, I was like, fuck it. It's like if what like
you mean mid to late 20s. Yeah, you're not in the mid to late 30s yet.
Yeah.
Don't age yourself.
Yeah, oopsies. Yeah, by the mid to late 20s, I had basically just said, well, if this is what you want, because the other part was that you started seeing all these things that people were self-censoring on dating apps and things like that, or even just social media of like, they were it's like the stated versus revealed preferences. Is even though people would state something, what they actually wanted was something else, which is most people would prefer to be in a long-term committed relationship. So it was like, fuck it, it's like I'll hedge my bets. If people are afraid to admit it, I'll stand up front. Maybe it's a little bit of tall poppy syndrome, or at least the reverse of that, because in other places in the world, people are afraid to stand and say, fuck it, this is what I believe in, and so be it.
Yeah.
To me, I guess I thought about it in this way, is like, if someone was going to have a reversion to that, they would self-select. And I was like, cool, I don't need to do the extra effort to do the, like do the scratch and sniff like we were talking about earlier. It's like, I don't want to have to filter you if that's something you don't want. Cool.
Yeah. Which is part of it's for authenticity.
Yeah.
And again, self-knowledge and everything that comes with it. Right. It's that if you just act the way that you truly are, in some sense, you'll get what you need.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a way to put it is almost like life gives you what you ask of it.
Yeah, but you can be,
both bad, positive,
knowing that
and
you
negative.
Can be asking of life some things that you don't want.
Yes. I was going to say, it doesn't mean that it's always good.
Sometimes you're asking for it. You know what I mean?
Yes. Right. Like if you go to the bar all the time and you're drinking like crazy and
you start a fight.
Yeah, exactly.
You're asking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, this works both ways. It just because we might talk about these things positively doesn't mean
the learning experience can be tough.
Right. And maybe that's the lesson you need to learn.
Yeah, maybe it's because you weren't listening, and the only way that life could get you to listen was to be increasingly...
A knuckle sandwich?
Yeah. Get a little louder every time it tries to teach you something.
I mean, that's a funny way to put it, but it's true, I think, to some degree.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you have that tangent still in mind, or was that too long ago?
Gone.
Done forever?
Yeah, forever. Lost to the currents of history.
Ironically speaking, as we tangent on it. I don't know. Any other thoughts? Let's see how we're doing. Just over an hour right now.
I'm all right. I'm content with what we did.
Yeah, no, we kind of
wandered around.
Yeah, wandered around, did our thing.
Had a good time.
Yeah. We know you're doing your PhD. I feel like every time we do these year in review ones, it's like, what's new for Joe? we kind of hit that in the beginning this time around. But
yeah, well, cross your fingers, say your prayer.
Yeah.
Let's hope for the university.
Here's hoping that it's not as crazy as it was during the pandemic for you to get into a university.
Though I did get into Chicago for the master's.
That is true.
And then I went to Vanderbilt because I thought, So now I want to do my PhD at Chicago. So we'll see.
Yep. Well, everyone, it's that's 2025. We didn't do a lot of podcasts this year. We just mostly did Arcane Season 2, but
it's great.
We'll be back. We got too much stuff to talk about, as always. We still need to do your Substack episode of just everything you've been exploring.
Oh, man. That's a rabbit hole. I'll have to reread some of it.
I know, but I just like, so Joe, what have you been writing about? That's literally what it's going to be.
They take you on a journey.
Yeah, exactly. Need a whiteboard.
No problem.
Later.